Members, we now move to the Victims Order Against Violent Offenders Bill. When we were last considering the bill, we were debating Part 2. Carol Beaumont has the call. She has 4 minutes remaining, should she wish to avail herself of that opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much. Well, Labor supports this bill, and we think that Part 2 does provide, with the provision of non-contact orders, the opportunity to fill a gap that is currently there, because the measures that are currently in place to protect victims of serious crime, the Domestic Violence Act, of course, provides for protection orders, but that means that basically they have to have been a situation where they were in a domestic relationship, and the Harassment Act provides for restraining orders, but only in circumstances of harassment. So basically the notion here is that we are talking about a non-contact order, and these can be applied for in Clause 7 here in Part 2. Non-contact order. A victim may not apply for such a non-contact order if another form of order is currently in place. So that's important. It's not in addition to those other situations I've talked about, protection orders and restraining orders. It's a distinct situation, and it will cover the sorts of situations where somebody might, for example, and as we have seen evidenced in this country, choose to live next door to somebody that they have seriously assaulted, raped, whatever. So, look, we of course support a bill like this where we are trying to do something to recognise the ongoing effect of serious violent offending on victims, and recognising that, in fact, we do have a real problem with serious violent offending in this country. There is no two ways about it, and of course it's interesting that we are speaking on these victims' orders this week, when we have in fact had the Glenn inquiry report, or part of it, the part that dealt with 500 interviews with people who have basically had violence against them, or people who are working with women and children primarily who have been victims of domestic violence. And so it is quite timely that we are continuing to work our way through this Victims Orders Against Violent Offenders Bill. So I guess one of the other things I would point out at this stage is, while we support this bill, we do have significant concerns about the piecemeal approach that is being taken around dealing with violent crime. And we will, and I'm sure colleagues of mine will be traversing this ground tonight about what we might do in a broader sense. And the Glenn inquiry does, of course, give us the opportunity to reflect on what we need to do. And they have, in that report that's been released this week, raised substantive concerns about not only the magnitude of the problem we face, but the way that the justice system is actually not working for victims of violent crimes. So while this bill fills a particular gap, and we support it, and we think that it's a useful additional thing, what we really need to be looking at, if we were serious as a parliament, is we need to be looking at this whole area. We need to look at substantial reform in the justice system particularly. We need to look at reform in our policing, and of course we need to look at the wider issues around basically trying to prevent violent crime. And I note for the record that in response to the Glenn inquiry, we had questions in the House this week. Mr Chair.
I call the honourable member Carol Beaumont.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. We did have questions in the House this week where we were talking about what the government's response was to that Glenn inquiry, and that approach, rather than a very narrow approach as is outlined in this bill, we suggested to the government, Labor suggested to the government, that we actually have some sort of cross-party consensus on issues like domestic violence, that we actually work together as a parliament to try and look at real change across the whole range, from prevention to looking after those who have been victims of violent crimes, particularly in the Glen inquiry we were looking at domestic violence, but we also as a parliament are very actively raising issues around sexual violence, and the Social Services Select Committee is of course considering that issue at the moment. We really need, as members of parliament, to say we have some responsibility in this space to make change to try and prevent violent crime, but also then to look after those who are victims of such violent crime, and to make sure that the criminal justice system doesn't re-victimise them, doesn't make it too hard for them to get justice, to see those who have offended held to account for that offending. So there were very good changes made in the bill as a result of the work of the Select Committee. I wasn't on that Select Committee, but I want to acknowledge some of those changes. The Select Committee, for example, amended Clause 7 of the bill to allow an application any time after sentencing, so that there isn't potentially a gap at the point where the person is released from prison, and there is a wider scope to the orders than parole conditions could provide. So I think that was a very positive situation. There is also another concern that we've got, and that is in relation to an application for an order being a civil proceeding, and that victims would have to meet costs unless they qualify for legal aid. And the Select Committee has mitigated that somewhat by allowing two types of order, temporary and final, where the offender would, and this is in relation to the situation where the victim has to take their case to a judge in the presence of an offender. That's been mitigated to a certain extent by allowing two types of orders, temporary and final, where the offender would only be present for the application to make a temporary order a final one. This would also assist in lowering cost and contact with the offender, but not eliminate it. So we do continue to have a concern on that particular issue. I think the interesting point on this, as I said earlier, is that this is quite a specific thing. The regulatory impact statement said that potentially the number of orders that are likely to be issued on average could be as little as 10 per year. Now, that's not a reason not to do something, but I do go to my earlier point that there are a broader range of issues which I think as a country we really do have a strong desire to see addressed. And I would like to urge the government to look more broadly at these issues, to not keep working in a piecemeal approach, which is what is happening at the moment. And I would suggest that we do use the opportunity created by the Glen inquiry to actually acknowledge that the community certainly sees the desire for a much more comprehensive, collaborative and committed response to ensuring that the victims of violent crime are not further penalised.
Mr. Chairman, I call the Honourable Phil Goff.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Right at the start of the debate, when this bill was introduced, Labor said that it would support the